Now, this is supposed to be, I don't know if it amplifies us because I don't hear any amplification.
I hear
Oh, you do?
amplification.
Okay. Hello? Is this functioning? Okay. Hello. Thank you all for attending today. We're all really pleased, of course, to have Professor Maya Tudor here from Oxford University. Many of you here, the vast majority of you here, are intimately familiar with Professor Tudor's work by virtue of having read the book that we will discuss today, which is published by Cambridge University Press about 4 years ago?
2013.
Yeah. Oh, okay. The Promise of Power. And the book is a study of the origins of democracy and autocracy in Pakistan. Origins is a key word because it adopts an approach that goes back in time historically and explains later political developments on the basis of key organizations, events, actors, circumstances that took place many years, in certain cases, prior to independence. So, Maya, thank you for coming here. You arrived just in the nick of time. Yeah. Flight delay, of course, as always. But what we'll do is the following. This is the format. We will go for exactly 60 minutes. And I know exactly because I have several people that will not allow us to go beyond 60 minutes. And then those 60 minutes will consist of a series of questions that I will deliver to, may I just say Maya?
Yes, of course.
To Maya. And the way I always approach this is I don't assume, in this case I can assume it, but I usually don't assume that anyone has read the book. So therefore, questions that are detached from any foundational knowledge are a little less valuable and understandable than those that are attached to some foundational knowledge. So before each question, I provide a little bit of a summary, 2-3 minutes of some key points in the book, and then use that as the motivator for a question, and which Maya can just address in any form that she likes. This is a very loose and informal, yet serious discussion, and they're always really quite enjoyable. And this is being videoed, which I'm happy to hear, because one session I held, a really nice one with David Collier about 2 years ago, he loved it so much he wanted to use it in his classes, but some technical glitches didn't make that possible. So we have a lot of good experience with these things, and in part because we have such, well, in whole, because we have such good guests. So thank you, Maya. So just to begin, the book tries to understand why Pakistan experienced a dominant regime type of autocracy alongside continuous regime instability, while India, by contrast, experienced a stable democracy. So there are essentially two key dependent variables here: the type of political regime and the degree of stability of the regime. Starting in 1952 with national elections, India consistently stable. Pakistan already with what you call bureaucratic coups in 1953 and 1954, not to mention subsequent coups, 58, 77, 99, experienced periods of autocracy alongside spells of democracy, hence regime instability. Now, what's nice about your book, Maya, is you always, even within one paragraph, on more than one occasion, will be very careful to distinguish your key independent variables and whether they matter more for type of regime or stability of regime, which are two they're completely different phenomena. One key factor that you identify as influencing the type of regime is the nature of the dominant social class interests in the two respective independence movements. And following the legacy of Barrington Moore, consistent with that, Pakistan's landed aristocracy bode not so well for democratic prospects, as opposed to India's urban, educated middle class. In contrast to regime type, you identify the organizational strength of political parties as being key for regime stability. That's fundamentally the key questions and variables in your study. Of course, it's the details of this that we will spend our time on. But in addition, since we have such a diverse audience, I try to cover topics that are often extended to broader areas of research design and methodology. But for the moment, let's consider, just to start out, the following list of academic topics, areas, fields, variables that in one way or another are not merely touched upon, but carefully examined in your study. Political regimes, individual cases, paired comparison of two cases, political parties, nationalism, social classes, colonial legacy, level of economic development, and that's relative contextual importance. So there's a lot of topics.
Yeah.
That's a lot of stuff. So could you, for the benefit of everyone here, and in particular for the students, say a little bit about how your interest in training in such a diversity of topics within political science, how they developed, how they congealed, the decision making that went into your design of this particular study, how you put them together. How did this come to be?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to Michael for organizing this visit. I think he reached out a year ago, and I was on sabbatical, and so I'm glad to finally be here, and for all of you for showing up and for the interest in the topic. So I think there are two questions smuggled into that broader question of how this project developed. One is why my interest in these particular cases, and then there's a question about how analytically it developed into such a broad project that involved a lot of those concepts that you listed. So I'm going to start with a personal story because I often find that that's just interesting to people. So I just began interested in questions of kind of comparative political and economic development because I grew up myself somewhat kind of confused about my own personal identity because I was born in India to an Indian father and a German mother, and I didn't spend very much time in India because my parents separated when I was quite young, and but I, from a very young age, was interested in questions of why some of my peers didn't have shoes and others had second homes, why I was sort of an outsider in both contexts of India and Germany and family contexts and so forth. And so I think that motivated a general interest in the study of regimes and economic development. So I first sort of studied economics and wanted to go into actually economics initially and worked at the World Bank as my first job. I then went to work in Bangladesh for an NGO that was called the Bangladesh Rural Advancement Committee. And it was during that time when I was in Bangladesh, and I actually went to go see my biological father then kind of for the first time, that I traveled from Bangladesh to India. Bangladesh was part of Pakistan at the foundation or at the separation of India or the independence of the British colonial regime in India. And so I noticed as I traveled between the two countries differences in the politics, differences in the economic development trajectories, and I began to ask myself the question of why these two countries look different. And then it was when I went to graduate school, first in a master's in public policy, and then in my doctoral at the political science program, that I began to think about this question in the context of what I was studying in political science. And then I looked at what other people had said about this question of why did India and Pakistan look so different? Partly because I had in my courses on democratization and regime outcomes, we all know that India is an outlier. And yet much of the research at the time that I was looking around at what was being read or what was written said that either, look, India is an outlier, but it's an N of 1, Or they said, here are the cases, here's a history of India's political development that only looks at India. And I said, well, but, using the comparative method, we should be able to say something a little bit more structural about India's case, and Pakistan was the natural comparison because it was, after all, part of the same regime. So that, I think, is the first question. How does my own interest in this topic develop? But there's a separate question of how do I get to this broad sweep of classes and regime types and political parties and nationalism? And I didn't go into this project motivated by those concepts. I went into this project motivated by a puzzle. And that puzzle was, why do these two countries look so different today? In some ways, they don't look that different. It bears repeating. But they do look in some important ways different. And what is the genesis of that difference? And that really motivated me. I didn't go in thinking I would have this argument. I actually went in thinking it was probably the military that was different. After all, Pakistan inherited a much larger share of the colonial military. That argument has actually subsequently been made by a professor at Yale, Steve Wilkinson. We've talked about this. I disagree with that argument, but I think it is an intellectually serious argument, and that was where I began. But I think, as Michael alluded to, and will allude to later, I realized that very quickly after independence of these two countries in 1947, the difference becomes apparent. So the Indian Constituent Assembly is already hard at work in creating the Indian Constitution before independence even happens. The Constitution of India is basically finished at the end of 1949. 1950 it's ratified. 1952 elections are held. A defense minister is created in 1953 that subordinates the chief military officers to civilian control. So it became very quickly clear to me in the course of my research that my priors were wrong, and that actually you see this difference in these two countries emerging very quickly and upon independence, and that therefore the explanatory factors had to be before independence. And the nationalist movements weren't just nationalist movements, but under the British colonial regime, they actually had to contest elections. So that's why I call them quasi-parties, nationalist movements, political parties for the period before independence. And then it was a kind of process of regress. As I moved backward, then the question began, okay, well, if these two independence movements or political parties look different, why is that the case? Where does that come from? And so that began the process of moving backwards and saying, well, actually, it was the nature of these historically conditioned class interests that leads them to both articulate a different kind of nationalism on the one hand and build different kinds of political parties.
Thank you. You mentioned something. I always prepare kind of a script for this, but it never really stays on script because someone like you always says something that is very engaging.
Yes, it starts there.
I'm going to try to go a little bit off script, but still get into the question I was going to mention, which is your approach is one that generally is referred to as comparative historical analysis. I mean, if you look at your book, it's very interesting that it is not until the end of Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 that you reach the year 1947. Mm-hmm. And is there 6 or 7 chapters in the book? I don't know. But you're 4/5 of the way through the book before you hit 1947. So you're explaining post-independence regime type instability by examining pre-independence developments, which is consistent with the comparative historical analysis approach, which emphasizes, large-scale outcomes and causal factors, generally aggregate kinds of cases, and in particular, and I think this is really nicely manifested in your book, outcomes are explained by the intersection of multiple events and processes, which interact. So context matters. You have a paired comparison, 2 cases. And if we think here of a definition I'm going to give 2 definitions of a case study. John Gehring says, a case study is the intensive study of a single case where the purpose is to shed light on a larger class of cases.
Mm-hmm.
And George and Bennett say, a case study is the detailed examination of an aspect of a historical episode to develop or test historical explanations that may be generalizable. Mm. You write, this book seeks to help shed new light on the causes of democratization in post-colonial societies. So your stated ambition is perfectly consistent with that of our most distinguished writers on the case study method, which go out of their way to emphasize, perhaps understandably defensively in a way, the value and potential of case studies for generating inferences on a larger population, as opposed to the completely unfair stereotype of n equals 1, n equals 2, overdetermination, too many variables, too few. We've all heard this too much. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that? A, your ambition to, and the degree to which you feel you have achieved knowledge that allows us to infer to a broader population, and how scholars should approach such objectives in a case study or a paired comparison.
Mm-hmm. It's a really interesting question. I think before I answer the question, which I've duly noted, but I think it's worth saying that, I spent, as you said, 3/4 or 4/5 of the book talking about the historical context and the developments in these countries before independence in 1947. And I had a committee of 4 advisors, one of which was the external. That is to say, they weren't on my committee, my dissertation committee. And so that means they hadn't read it at all before, whereas the others had read the chapters and progress and so forth. And I emailed it to this external member, and actually had already arrived at Oxford. I was there on a postdoc. And having read about 2/3 of the book, I'll never forget this. This external committee member emailed me and said, "I don't see what this book has to do with democratization in South Asia, and I don't think I'm ready to pass you at this point." So, as a very, very eminent scholar, currently a professor at MIT. So, and I, of course, I was very nervous at that point. But so, I think that highlights the importance of sort of sticking to your the way that you want to do things, if at the same time taking advice on how to make it better. So in terms of how to, as I understand the question, how do I think about the case study in the context of the goal, the ambition to generalize beyond those 2 cases, and to what degree do I think I've achieved some success in that? So, I mean, look, to some degree, it is a case study it is a paired case study of 2 cases that really speaks mostly to those 2 cases. I would argue those are important cases that in and of themselves deserve some serious scrutiny in terms of understanding these trajectories. And in the concluding chapter, I talk a little bit about Malaysia, for example, and how some of these dynamics travel to Malaysia. And I think that the purpose of the comparative method is always to think very closely about the causal dynamics that underpin a certain set of political outcomes. And again, we don't want to rehash all these methods, wars, because I think that there's enormous benefit in these different approaches. And there are big drawbacks to each one of these. What I think is the especial benefit of the comparative historical case method, and some of the ways in which that's captured in those descriptions you gave, is that it helps us to really understand those causal processes in real detail. And, if one says, look, for example, as many scholars have done, there's a strong statistical relationship between democracy or development and democracy, but we don't know the mechanism through which that causal process unfolds, then we haven't really learned that much in terms of policy. We haven't even really learned that much in terms of comparison. So to my mind, it is the real advantage of this method is to really put the process, the mechanisms under a magnifying glass. So I think in that count, I feel I've really succeeded. Where I think I get a kind of middling grade is on speaking to the processes of post-colonial democratization in the cases beyond these two countries. You know, if I had infinite time, this project took me from start to finish 7 years. I had a child along the way, so it was 6 years of really full time working on it. I maybe would have added a few cases, but I think to do it well, one really needs to spend the time understanding the history. So the project I'm involved in now will actually do something quite a bit more ambitious. We'll do 6 case studies plus statistical work. So I'm trying to do a little bit more of that so that I can be a bit more ambitious in the generalizability dimension.
Okay. I'm just going to develop this a little bit. Your book is really impressive in your ability to very effectively trace these processes. Perhaps one thing you didn't mention about maybe the added potential for your book to be more generalizable in terms of its findings that you didn't mention is you start out, the first chapter, the key chapter on theory and method, is 45 pages long or something like this. Mm-hmm. And so you root your study in extremely rigorous and well-established theoretical and empirical research.
Right.
And you lay this, so it's not like you're just looking around and exploring. You are, as we're taught to be, guided by theory.
Absolutely.
And you lay this out so rigorously and carefully so that when we get into the history, the combination of your effective narrative in the process tracing plus the model that we have been introduced to means that the rest of the book just flows naturally and you understand everything. So the general theory that you use contributes, I think, also. Yeah.
Let me say a little bit about that. So the comparative historical, I didn't delve into this, but maybe I should just say a bit about this, is that, the idea of the controlled comparison is that you are controlling for the most commonly cited explanations of the outcome, right? So what you're doing is you're not selecting on the dependent variable, but you're looking to maximize variation on the dependent variable, while also minimizing the number of independent variables upon which there's variation, right? So British colonial legacy, Matthew Lang has written a book on why that is slightly more conducive than a French colonial legacy to democratization. Controlled for, right? Because it's largely similar. One can quibble about this, and I often spend my time with historians who, do want to quibble about it, but largely speaking, in a comparative sense, they're similar. Economic development. Pakistan, slightly better off on average, right? So one would think actually predictive it's going to do better, and it does slightly worse. Diversity, largely thought of as inimical to democracy. India is slightly more diverse. You would have predicted to do more poorly. So I do use the controlled comparison and what we know in political science to be robust explanations for the outcome in question, namely democratization and regime stability to some degree. I could try to control for that with this comparison. And so that the comparative method, if it's well used, can do precisely that. So I think it was written after I published, or certainly after I had done my research for this book, but Evan Lieberman has a very nice piece about nested research design and although this wasn't written out at the time, I certainly follow that method of, you have causal associations. Let's say you have one independent variable and an outcome of interest. and there's an association, and then you have real outliers. And you use those outliers as a way of building new theory. And that's another way of thinking about what I do in this book. As I say, economic development, diversity, British colonial legacy, here's what you'd expect, and then here's a real outlier from that statistical association. And let's build on that outlier and see, why is it different? Is it different for reasons that we expect, or is it different for different reasons? And that helps to create new theory.
Thank you. Excuse me. A Lieberman article that you mentioned, most of these people will be reading it next semester in my research design course.
Yep.
Which is also stuff on mixed methods and how all this, I imagine what you will be doing in your upcoming project, but we'll get to that in a minute. But what you just talked about here is in many ways the tradition, starting with Steinrocken, of our department here of comparative politics, the comparative method, most similar systems design, Mill's method of difference, whatever. But in so many cases, in so many instances of research projects, it's hard to get that to work in any manner that is more than kind of not very reliable. Mm-hmm. But in your case, I mean, it's like made for this.
Yeah.
You know, you can check off all the variables that are controlled for: colonial legacy, ethnic diversity, level of economic development, level of inequality. You're left with a subset of independent variables, and you have your key variables. So this book, in many ways, should be read in courses on research design under that topic of the comparative method. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So congratulations. But generally speaking, do you also think this is a very difficult method to apply in other contexts that are not so well suited for it as yours is?
Yes and no. I mean, I think one has to think carefully about what are the scope conditions that delimit the kinds of phenomena that you're interested in examining. So in my case, I was always very interested in understanding political developments in South Asia. So I wasn't, and then I have to ask myself, why am I limiting myself to South Asia? What is it about these cases? And then if you're really clear, and I think this extends more generally, it became clear to me that there were a couple of reasons for that. So, for example, state building happens in a very compressed period of time, and nation building happens in a very compressed period of time. And those are often in very close chronological proximity to each other. That is true of most of the post-colonial world outside of the Americas. And so then as I'm doing in my current project, if I can sort of talk a little bit about that project will look at post-colonial countries in Asia and founding national narratives in order to understand the kinds of nationalisms that arise during that kind of key moment, which is the decades before independence and then the decade of independence and after, when the national narrative settles. What kind of a national narrative emerges in these countries, and how is that national narrative used at particular moments in history after that? And I can talk a little bit more about that if there's interest later. So there I'm choosing cases that are not, of course, as perfectly curated as the South Asia comparison is. But Singapore, Malaysia is one comparison I will do in that. They were both part of the Malay Federation. Now the ethnic composition is slightly different in those. And so then I have to engage very clearly, very deeply with the alternative explanation of, is this driven by that different ethnic composition? So I don't think it's as difficult to do. I think it's easier to do at my stage in career, frankly, because I think it is hard to do everything. It is hard to do statistical work and really know your cases and know language and do archival work and read broadly. And my chair actually pushed me very hard. I mean, I have an economics background. He said, why don't you just throw in some statistical work? And I said, well, look, I can do it, but there are lots of other people doing this. Let me spend my time in the archives doing this comparison well. That is where I feel the value added will be. Now, I think in this project that I'm now working on, which is a comparative study of nationalisms, there isn't that much statistical work. So there I feel there's a real value added for me. And I have spent this last year actually together with some research assistants using the existing database to put together an index of how inclusive or exclusive founding nationalisms are in the kind of 90 countries that we've identified that are post-colonial countries that have gained independence in this sort of the 20 years post-World War II, using that as a kind of a general scope. And there I'm creating a kind of a new database. But, so to speak to this question of methods again and how easy or hard is it to do, I think you have to, when I tell my graduate students, start with something you're really interested in understanding. Because to spend 6 or 7 years at it, it's a very lonely process to be writing and thinking and researching or number crunching, whatever you're going to be doing. So you have to have something that's driving you beyond just, this is strategically the right thing to study. And then be rigorous about it. And rigor can assume lots of different forms. It can assume the kind of comparative historical method, game theory, stats. Now the kind of the new frontier is big data and data scraping and so forth. So there are lots of methods, but the methods are there in service of what we should, I think, all be doing, which is asking big, important, policy engaged questions.
I like how you mentioned rigorous. It takes a while to understand what rigorous means.
Yeah.
This is rigorous. You have your eye on the ball the whole time. You have your variables that matter, and they're constantly embedded in the historical narrative. And that is essentially what process tracing is supposed to be. So this is rigorous, but I think it takes students a while to understand what rigorous means, what analytical means, as opposed to just presenting information. Now, one thing I wanted to do today, and it was an oversight because I was busy preparing, is I wanted to send emails specifically to two of my colleagues, Professor Lars Svorsand and Professor Lisa Rockner, and I forgot to do it. But luckily, Lisa is here because they both have interest in political parties, amongst many other things. Can we turn to that topic for the moment?
Sure.
The organizational strength of political parties is the key independent variable for explaining regime stability in your study. But what is organizational strength? You spend a bit of time on this because it's not self-evident. You talk about the importance of the nationalist ideology having some programmatic content. For example, in the Indian case, there was a clear programmatic commitment to particular economic and social principles, egalitarian democracy. But you say that this content, egalitarian or not, will affect regime type. So political party content and nationalist ideology, they work in complicated ways to affect different independent variables. So I'm going to ask if you could summarize this a little bit, and I'll just add a couple more details. One thing you emphasize important as well is that there should be some coherence to the constituents of the respective party. In other words, if you're representing these two groups, their interests should be more or less compatible. That was not the case in the Pakistani Muslim League case. Right. You mentioned organization, procedures. Can you talk a little bit about political parties and this key factor of organization and content and the enormous consequences for your cases?
Yeah, I know it can be complicated when you're both reading in the details and then moving back and forth between the details and the theory. So let me just spend a moment to summarize. The most proximate variable to the outcomes of stability is the party. So the party strength brokers' regime stability. And that's not a new argument that harkens back to Huntington, among others, but famously Huntington. But what do I mean by programmatic, by party strength? So there's an organizational, internal party organization aspect to it. That's the first one. There are three. The second one is the coherence of the distributive interests in the core alliance. And the third one is the presence of an ideology. The presence of an ideology. Now, that is different from the content of that ideology. So the fact that there's an ideology matters for stability, and the content of that ideology matters for democracy. So those are the ways I'm distinguishing that. So I'll unpack that a little bit. So the programmatic, the core alliance that comes together is between what I call dominant peasants in the countryside, in the case of the Indian nationalist movements, and an urban educated middle class. And as I talk about, interests aren't just given by your place in the economic distribution. They're also formed by the ideas that you have of who you are. And I can talk about that again if there's interest. But so the core alliance between this urban educated middle class and this dominant peasantry is a coherent one, because what they share is both an interest in wresting power and resources from the state to those groups. So, for example, rural dominant peasants want lower agricultural land taxes. And the urban educated middle class, well, they want to staff the colonial state. So at a time when, if you were the governor of a province, of one of these British colonial provinces, you would make the equivalent of what the U.S. American president makes today, right? So it was a very, very lucrative proposition to be in the colonial state. So in the context of that time, the urban educated middle class understood its interests as best being served by trying to grab hold of the state. And so it formed an alliance with where the vast majority of the population lived in the countryside, with the dominant peasants. And this group shared an interest in gaining resources and power from the state, but also in preventing too much downwards redistribution. And so that was the coherence to that alliance. Now, in Pakistan's case, there were, of course, two geographically separate wings of the country at the moment of independence. And in one wing, there were large, very, very large landed aristocrats who were, in fact, created 100 years before independence, in part through the economic policies of the British colonial regime. And they had an extraordinary amount of both of political, economic, and social power. And in the other wing of Pakistan, essentially, landless peasants staffed the Pakistan independence movement. And these groups just shared very little in the way of interests. One wanted to keep the colonial state on. The other wanted massive land didn't. The other wanted land redistribution to prevent land redistribution. And the landless peasantry wanted lots of land redistribution. So these structures created very little scope for what I would argue is a coherent set of alliances. So that's the first subcategory of coherence alliances. The second category is of the content, or the fact that there are some ideas or some ideology, some ideological content. So I looked, for example, through the papers of these nationalist movements in the 7 years before independence, so 40 to 47. And they had an annual meeting, and I looked at every page of those annual meetings. And then I coded how much of this is talking about real content, right, as opposed to this is what we're doing, but here's what we will do with independence once we have independence. And a substantial proportion, a quarter, a third of the Indian independence movement was devoted to discussing actual programs, actual policies, ideas about what they would, not just the ideas, but we're going to have universal adult franchise. We're going to do some kind of land reform. Those were ideas which bound these groups together. it doesn't matter so much for stability that you what those ideas were. What matters is that you had some ideas that served as a kind of glue to hold these disparate groups together. And you simply didn't have that in the Pakistan independence movements. And again, those records of those years before independence show it. And the final difference is actually the kind of the infrastructure of the party. Now, the party develops independently of class interests over time, but you have to have these shared interests for the party to initially develop, which returns you to the question of it's party that's most proximate, but for a party to arise, for party dynamics to define post-independence democratic negotiations and regime politics, you have to have a party dynamic that emerges in the first place. It emerges in the Indian case and not in the Pakistani case. And in the Indian case, you have things like a party whip, which is supposed to be able to get all of the top leaders and of the provinces on board with the key decisions taken by party leaders. And they're often... It's very interesting to read these papers because there is disagreement. There is often, on some issues, profound disagreement about how to proceed on some of these questions. But there is discussion, there's lots of discussion, and the nationalist high command, so the kind of 10 big leaders, they spend an extraordinary amount of time trying to convince the people who dissent to come onto their side, right? Now, these party institutions do exist to say, ultimately, you've got to fall into line. And at moments, you see the effect of the party. For example, at one point, there is a proposal made in the course of constitutional pre-independence negotiations, which would substantially disadvantage two provinces, but as a whole benefit Congress. And so the Congress leaders in those two provinces want very much to dissent, but they are told by their top Congress leaders, you cannot publicly dissent against these policies. We're going to accept this policy as a party. And you see that the regional politicians fall in line. And you contrast that after independence with what happens in Pakistan, where the regional politicians absolutely do not fall in line with what the party high command says. So those are the kind of three subcomponents of the party that I argue brokers party regime stability. But the content, so the type of ideas that are in that are articulated in the run-up to independence, I argue are very critical for the fact that you get democracy in India, the core institutions of democracy being adopted, universal adult franchise, elections, and so forth. So, so it's the content of nationalism that is critical for democracy to be created, and that's where I'm very much spending my time working on now. Sorry, this keeps falling down. So, okay, so that's sort of how these very different pieces are moving in the context of the book. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. But just one little development of that. Neither of the two movements was in any real way oriented towards radical politics.
Correct.
But there did exist factions and tendencies in that direction,
yes,
which were, in both cases, effectively dealt with,
yes,
in different ways. What was the potential there for such radical tendencies, if they had developed more, to have undermined some of the developments that eventually took place, in particular on the Indian side?
It's interesting. I mean, I think this is actually interesting to think about in the context of politics today, and it's a question. I spent the last year in the United States. I have American citizenship as well as German citizenship, so I'm thinking about it in the context of American politics today as well. And I think the question you're posing for me is, what is the role for kind of a radical flank in kind of revolutionary times to either stabilize or potentially destabilize a kind of a grand coalition. And I would actually turn that question on its head to say, I think in the case of the Indian independence movement, it's absolutely crucial that you do have a radical wing. So to dive into the weeds for a moment, before Gandhi comes on the scene from South Africa, the Indian nationalist movement is composed of, 3/4 of the members of the movement are composed of urban, at a time when 90% of the country, over 90% of the country lives in rural areas. Brahmin, which is, tiny proportion, few percentage points of the population's upper caste. Lawyers, educated in British colonial institutions, right? So this is a tiny, tiny minority in what is colonial India. And they are completely immersed in the culture and the ideas of what it means to be British, right? They think of themselves as Brits in some sense, and they have no interest in radical politics. And it's after 10, 20 years of no change in politics, after polite petitioning, which happens over a period of, it has happening already at the start in the late 1890s, begins to pick up a little steam in 1990, in the early 1900s, the first decade of the 1900s. And it's really when 1919 there are some reforms in the British colonial regime, and those reforms really changed nothing. I mean, they're window dressing. That's when radical politics really takes off. And it's at that time that Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi returns from South Africa. He returns in the teens, I think it's 15, 16, he returns from South Africa. And he begins to experiment with this kind of civil disobedience. And he's very localized. He picks one conflict, goes to that conflict, says, I don't want any involvement from the nationalist movement. I'm going to immerse myself. And he lives with, for example, the indigo, the farmers who are planting indigo and who are not getting, who have a very high land tax imposed upon them, and they're therefore really experiencing economic hardship. And the radical flank is energized by him because they see him as actually doing something besides petitioning, besides legal briefs in court that have been tried for 20 years and have achieved nothing. And the moderates, or that are doing these legal petitionings, they're also getting frustrated. So you need, this is a roundabout way of saying you need both of those flanks. You need the radical to push essentially the moderates towards some sort of compromise. And so, I've been talking last year. I gave a couple talks at Stanford about what do we think about, how do we make some parallels between exactly these kinds of questions, radical flanks, and how do we think about that in the context of current American politics. And look, I think regardless of where exactly the left is positioning itself, it's going to be called extreme by part of the right. So in a sense, it doesn't even really matter that you need to have these radical individuals who are pushing the envelope for, I think, the moderates to take up some of those ideas. So I actually think having a very vibrant kind of hot family feud, in Rostow's term, is actually really important for getting to places where you can eventually compromise.
Okay. You mentioned Rostow in your book. You mentioned Huntington. You mentioned Moore. You are nicely rooted in an incredibly powerful legacy of scholarship. Mm-hmm. And you use that as an effective springboard. I mean, Huntington, for example, there's different Huntingtons.
Of course.
But the 1968 political development is just phenomenal. Just phenomenal. And you quote from there an amazing quote, which I didn't remember, which is consistent with your emphasis upon political parties. Huntington says, military coups do not destroy parties. They simply ratify the deterioration which has already occurred. Now, military coups ratify the pre-existing deterioration of the parties. And this is consistent, again, as you alluded to 15 minutes ago, your emphasis for explaining Pakistan not on the basis of the military, but on the basis of the party. As you say, while military intervention was the direct cause of democracy's decline, Pakistan's early, pervasive, and intensifying political instability was not caused by the politicization of the military, but by the inability of its dominant political party to effectively govern.
Correct. Yeah.
Perfectly consistent with Huntington's statement. You do address the person in particular that focuses on the military in your book, and you do it in a pretty devastating manner. As I remember, very courteously, of course, but there's this large paragraph on one of the pages, and I think you have like 7. You said, the military argument does not hold up for the following 7 reasons.
Yes.
1, 2, 3. It fills up almost a whole page. Very effective argumentation, but in a polemical manner.
Yeah.
Do you feel still very confident, because so many people point to that military legacy element? I think your book is very persuasive, but have you gotten a lot of, in discussions, arguments to the contrary?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned, since I wrote this book, Steve Wilkinson has written a book on the army in Pakistan. Of course, Steve Cohen has written a piece before that. Look, I don't have a strong a priori sense that I'm absolutely 100% right. I am willing to be convinced if I see the research that backs it up that I'm wrong. I mean, look, good research stimulates a conversation. It's not the worst thing to be wrong. To my mind, as I think Michael said, I'd want to see the following kinds of research. I'd want to know that it was very early on the military that was actively driving the political instability that we saw in Pakistan. This kind of the inability, for example, of the early constituent assemblies to come up with a document that governed the country effectively. That's because they were deeply divided. That had nothing to do with the military. The military was being, in fact, in 1953, the first instance of martial law in Pakistan was when the military was called in to quell riots. That was effectively a provincial center conflict where landlords in Punjab didn't want essentially to assent to centralization of powers in the capital, and the result of that was that there was an engineered riot over this minority sect called the Ahmadiyyas, and this resulted in these large-scale riots in Lahore, and the military was called in to quell those riots. So, you see right there what is happening is you see a conflict between a regional center and the federal center, and that conflict is resolved by recourse to the military. Now, what would you expect to see if, by contrast, it was the military that was really the most important causal factor? You would expect to see that early on the top military leaders are in fact actively trying to intervene in politics. And I looked at the archives both in the UK and in the US of the kind of chief officials who were corresponding on the military side with these leaders, and there's just nothing in those archives that supports that conclusion. So I could be wrong, but I would want to see the research.
How much time do we have until it is 4 o'clock? Okay. Well, we touched upon the key themes. Tomorrow, for the benefit of our graduate students, we'll go into more of the nitty-gritty of research design and methods, which we touched upon a bit here. I hope this was of interest and use for such a diverse audience, but we did want to reserve plenty of time for questions, and hence, varsågod. Please. Yes.
I was thinking about when I was reading the chapter about alliance, chapter 4, and I was thinking about having control for activities that the trajectory of the Pakistani state was determined, in fact, by the development in India, because you highlight that the alliance between Punjab and Bengal came to be increasingly because the desire to not become irrelevant inside India. So I wonder, and also you talk about in chapter 3 with the ideology, you talk about that the Pakistani ideology was based on anti-India instead of proposing what it was for.
Right.
So I was wondering, how do you control for the effect that the India national movement, how that affected the Pakistani?
Yeah, that's a very good question because it's one of the ways in which, right, these two cases are interacting with each other. And I hear you saying, so they're not perfectly controlled for, because one is chronologically precedes the other, and so the other is naturally affected by those developments. And I think that's exactly right. I think that's easier. It's easier to deal with the second part of your question, which is about the anti fill in the blank nature of the movement. So in India's case, it's anti-colonial. And I think in Pakistan's case, it's anti-Hindu dominated. So they both actually have kind of boogeymen that they are reacting to. So I think in that sense, there is actually a similarity. And what distinguishes the two is that the Indian nationalist movement, partly as a result of having more time, right? The fact that as it developed much earlier, and this is something I actually wish I'd spent a little bit more time on in the book, having thought about it now with the hindsight of 6 years now, is that the Indian nationalist movement was started in 1885, and it simply had more time to iterate in terms of what were the right strategies and alliances and so forth that worked effectively to wrest power from the regime. So in the course of having more time, the Indian nationalist movement did develop not just an anti-ideology, but also what do we stand for, that the Pakistan nationalist movement didn't. In terms of alliances, I think that is something. I think you are onto something that, especially in the case of Punjab, less in the case of Bengal, because Bengal was big and then it was divided and then it was reunified, and so Bengal as a for the benefit of those who haven't kind of read the book or don't know the context, is set in most of the until 1937. British Indian politics were the sum of provincial politics. So then one has to look at the provinces and what's going on in the provinces. And there are 3 or 4 that are especially important for various reasons. Bengal is one of them. UP is another. Punjab is a third. And in Punjab and Bengal, which are the Muslim majority provinces, which subsequently get cleaved, cut in half, each half joining respectively India and Pakistan. In that case, you really have you do have the alliances, particularly in Punjab, responding to the developments at an all-India level. I think that they could have gone slightly differently, but not radically differently. I guess that's the way that I ultimately answered that question. But I think it's a really good question, and it's something I probably should have highlighted a bit more in the book.
Thank you. Snora?
Yeah. So my question is about nationalism, because it's a topic I'm quite interested in. You talk about how the Indian nationalist movement developed, and do you think that your study does have high internal validity? Do you think to what degree to which can we actually like generalize about nationalist movements elsewhere? Because there's another case who also has like post British colonial rule, which is Ireland, which also developed a quite strong nationalist movement in the 80s and the 90s with Conrad na Gaeilge, which is the Gaelic League. So to what degree do you think we can use nationalism and having a strong nationalist movement developing into institutions and then parties to essentially, to what degree can we actually generalize to like nationalism about other like democratization processes in post-colonial countries?
All right, so there are a couple parts to that question, so I'll try to take them in pieces. So just to briefly recap, in my book, the content of nationalism, the ideas of who is the nation, who is the we, and who is not the we, are critical in brokering whether or not you get democracy. And so there's a question about how generalizable is that in other post-colonial contexts. That is exactly what I am spending my the next probably 6 years or so working on, which is this question about how this causal relationship, which I posit in the book, that the ideas of the we are responsible for creating the institutions of democracy in the Indian case. How generalizable is that? It's something I'm very much thinking about now, and stay tuned. But what my next project does is looks at these founding national narratives, not just in India and Pakistan, but I'm currently looking at Burma or Myanmar, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, and as an extension, the United States and Canada. Also post-colonial countries, like Ireland, share some similarities, some differences, and thinking about the ways in which the sense of the we, who is the we, conditions, one, whether democracy is created, and in the post-colonial moment, and two, to what extent it endures. So, right, democracy is a multi-causal phenomenon. Democracy is, I think of it as like a stool, and each of the legs on the stool is absolutely necessary for the seat to exist. And one leg is elections, and one leg is competition, and another leg is minority rights. And I would probably add a fourth leg of actually press freedom. I think that the leg of minority rights, so that element, that component of democracy, is systematically or more likely to be endangered where you have founding national narratives that centralize race, religion, or ethnicity as the sense of the we. Right. So there are countries, India, Indonesia, Singapore, that create senses of the we that are not fundamentally based on any of those fixed attributes. And that in the long run, I argue that that's a democratic resource. I've actually already made that argument. There's an article I have in a book called Parties, Movements, and Democracy in the Developing World. It's co-authored with Dan Slater, and it looks at India and Indonesia. Currently have an article under review on India and Malaysia, looking at exactly these kind of founding national narratives. So how do I think that plays out? If you think about, again, it's just something I'm thinking about as I read the paper. It was last year, I think, that Donald Trump said, "I'm a nationalist, okay? I'm a nationalist." And I think that the way that he frames his use of nationalism very much shares in common. There's lots in common with the way that the current Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, is also framing, reinterpreting Indian nationalism in Hindu majoritarian terms. And there's been lots of writing on how Trump is using, is kind of dog whistling, is the term, white nationalism. So the U.S. has this very interesting hybrid national identity. On the one hand, it's all about ideas, the sense of the we. You can make it you can, no matter where you come from, you can make it in this country if you work hard. So there are these kind of Horatio Alger kinds of myths that underpin American national identity. But we also know from lots of writing that there's a very clear racial divide in America. That's also there from the founding. The Constitution terms blacks 3/5 of a citizen, right? So that's a hybrid national identity. And I argue that that identity very much conditions the nature of debates. Now, it's not the only thing that causes democracy, but it's an important factor. And in fact, economic development, right, your level of economic development, it's a democratic resource. But as I show in the case of India, economic development doesn't determine whether you have a democracy or not. It simply makes it more or less likely. And I think that nationalism works a little bit like that. When you have a sense of the we that is not built on race, that's not built on religion, and it's not built on ethnicity, then it makes it slightly more likely that democracy is going to endure, in the sense that in moments of crisis, it's not as easy to take an other and to set them aside and to systematically deprive them of minority rights. And so that's the kind of comparative piece that I'm doing now.
I just want to bring forth one remark on that. You have another great quote from Gellner, where you say, he says, Gellner says, nationalism is an ideology that invents nations where they do not exist. But it does need some pre-existing differentiating marks to work with.
Yeah.
It's not created out of nothing. I think your remarks are consistent with that.
Yeah.
Just one other remark, if I may, before the question, which is, again, what's nice about your book, and what I really encourage people to read, is not just for what you'll learn, which is a lot, but it's such a refreshing source of knowledge, and such a refreshing change from the increasingly dominant professional output of articles that increasingly are heavily statistically oriented. But it's rooted also in classic literature. Mm-hmm. And when I read it, as someone who went to graduate school a while ago, it just makes me feel like this is not lost. It's good that this is not lost. Mm-hmm. So I think of the course I had with Suzanne Rudolph on Weber. I think of reading lists from David Layton. Yeah. Adam Przeworski, you get his syllabus and he says, I assume you've read the following books. Yeah. Before the first lecture, Guillermo O'Donnell's Modernization, Polyarchy, etc. More and more, you're retaining the tradition of building upon this knowledge, as opposed to maybe some of the professional necessities that increasingly push young scholars into very narrow articles that are really not rooted in the rich tradition of our discipline as much. And I don't think that's nostalgia on my part, or is it?
No, I don't think so. But I will also say that the people who do this work well, I think, are incredibly successful in the profession. And I don't mean just me. I mean, my writing group, I had a group of women who were graduate students with me. We met every week during the time that we were writing, except for when one of us was on maternity leave. And we, each of our dissertations follows in this tradition. Mm. We all have tenure. One's at Northwestern, another one's at Brown. We all have tenure. I think it is, the profession is harder than it used to be, and for all kinds of structural reasons. But I also think that if you do it well, the payoff is really rich. Mm.
Yes, thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. This is a fascinating talk, and I haven't read the book, but it was really useful to have, the questions and the summaries that you posed. So thank you too as well. I think your arguments, someone who comes from India, I think your arguments are very persuasive about the historical antecedents of the creation of India and Pakistan and the impact that it may have had on the trajectory of the two countries. But as you yourself have noted, there are so many other arguments that various scholars have put forward. And my work is very much rooted in history, so your method, I'm very sympathetic to the method. But I think we have to look at all the factors that happened post-independence for the different trajectories that they took. And just a few to mention, and you mentioned so many about the history and the military and so on. But even there are several things that happened post-independence which can perhaps account for the different paths that these two countries took. And I think it's kind of important also to hear what you think about that, because in many ways, India is an outlier, not just because India and Pakistan went on this different route, but India is also an outlier because all of South Asia kind of descended into a non-democratic phase. And of course, India went through its own 2-year period of emergency between 1975 to 1977. Things right now under the BJP, which is a highly strong party at the center right now, and also in many of the states, people are very upset with many of the things that are going on. But it still is an outlier in the sense that formal democracy has persisted for over 70 years, except for those 2 years that in between. And so we have to look at what happened post then. And I think, because even Bangladesh, which you described, came about as an independent nation in the 70s and did have democratic elections, has had a fair amount of authoritarian has traversed an authoritarian path. Sri Lanka, which has obviously had a different history. So all of South Asia, but for India, has been through that. So history is important, but there could be many, many other factors. And just to put a few on the table. So one of the explanations that is put forward is that unlike Jinnah, who died very quickly, in India, even though most of the leaders of the freedom struggle were dead, Mahatma Gandhi was assassinated in 1948, Sardar Patel died in 1950, Nehru survived till 1964. And that allowed in some ways some kind of continuity with the traditions of the past. So that's number one. The second argument, of course, is that it was so big that it was impossible for any group or party to sort of dominate at the center in the same way. And the third, of course, is something that you alluded to that you're going to be looking into in your further work is, I'm not a political scientist, I'm a lawyer. And, political scientists obviously look a lot at political parties and elections, and, that sort of has become the metric for democracy. So even though India is, I think, very anti-democratic in many ways, it sort of is a functioning democracy because it regularly holds elections. But at the same time, the other institutions, and you mentioned the media, but what about the courts and the lawyers played a very important part in the freedom movement. So the courts were really important also in the way that things shaped up. And it's interesting in a way because courts have been very strong in all the South Asian countries in the way that they have come out with judgments and so on. And so the question is, does it matter? Does it not matter to how these things played out? And then, of course, is the fact of the reason why Pakistan failed in part was because there are arguments about that within nationalism as well, that language is more unifying as it turns out than ethnicity or race, and the imposition of people have argued that the imposition of Urdu and the imposition of the fact that West Punjab prospered at the expense of East Punjab is what really led to the disintegration of Pakistan. So would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
How much time do we have?
12 minutes.
We have 12 minutes until 4:30. Okay, good.
All right. So I will try to be brief with what are excellent, but very many questions. So let me try to dissect them. So I hear a question about the role of leadership in brokering the post-independence, immediate post-independence democracy and institutions. Then I hear a question about in the longer term, so in terms of longer term democracy, the role of the courts and lawyers and so not just the courts, but the kind of the legal movement writ large. So let me just start with those. So I think it's important, and I think your questions really nicely draw our attention to this, to draw a distinction between the creation of democracy and its perpetuation. So, I think there is a reason, an intellectual reason, a kind of methodological reason. Actually, it's really primarily a methodological, to pay attention to the kind of first formative decade. And that's because we know that if you have a military coup during that formative decade, the conditional probability of having a subsequent military coup is much higher, statistically significantly much higher, right? So in other words, you have a coup in this early period, you're much more likely to have a subsequent coup. And you see that not just in Pakistan, but in Bangladesh and, in Indonesia. And you see that playing out in lots of other contexts. By contrast, the longer you have a constitution, the sort of the conditional probability of staying stable is also, given the data that we have so far, higher. So there is that's what we mean by critical juncture. There's a kind of increasing returns, or that those patterns that are established early on tend to repeat themselves for structural reasons. But I think you're right. The reasons for the creation of India's democracy, and I wouldn't call it Pakistan's failure, I just would call it instability. I mean, it's instability, and that doesn't preclude stability at some point. It's just a harder legacy to overcome. It's just, it's instability, but we've had a longer period of democracy. It's not impossible. I mean, look at Indonesia, that you could see a different trajectory. So the role of leadership, and this is a question I actually get a fair bit. I say these two cases are completely different, often from historians, interestingly. You say, you have one big leader in Pakistan, and that leader dies within a year of independence. And yeah, sure, Gandhi dies, but then sure, Patel dies, but you have Nehru, and he's around. But so I think the business partly, and this is kind of a more general answer, which I hope is of interest more beyond this kind of particular question, is you have to ask yourself also about these counterfactuals. What would have happened, again, if Nehru had died? Right? Because if what I hear you implying is that leadership is so important in forming that first decade, and India was blessed to have this one particular leader. And my answer to that is, well, what would have happened if Nehru died? Let's walk ourselves through that counterfactual, and I've done so in groups of historians. And there's no doubt in my mind that if Nehru had died, you would have had Rajaji. You would have had, there was a huge, not a huge, but probably a dozen other leaders that could have very easily stepped into Nehru's shoes. So then you have to ask yourself the question: why do we have a dozen leaders in India, not in Pakistan? And there I revert to my party argument. It's because the party had this organizational system of drawing provincial leaders and then having them sit in committees, take decisions, and that created the stuff of a party that allows India to stabilize. In subsequent moments, I think the drivers of democratic stability in the long term are different from the short term. I just finished this morning, I sent off a review of Gyan Prakash, who's a Princeton historian, who's just written this new book called Emergency Chronicles, and it's a review of India's emergency, which is this 21-month period between 1975 and 1977 where India's democracy breaks down. And he's I think begins in the top of his mind is, here's somebody who's elected and then uses their position and power to consolidate essentially autocratically power around themselves, and how is this stopped? And so he uses the kind of, so, I think that the courts didn't actually play that much of a role in stopping Indira Gandhi's emergency. And I'm not sure they're going to play that much of a role now. Now, Pakistan's a little different. The court has played a relatively important role in the lawyers' movement and bringing down the Musharraf, the last military incumbent. So, it's a long way of saying I think that the factors driving regime stability a la longue are different from the ones that are in the immediate moment, but there are methodological reasons to look in particular at that early moment because it does cast a long shadow.
Okay, we have time for a quick question and a quick response. Yes, there was one up early. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot for a very thoughtful talk. I have, although I also would have liked to ask a lot of questions, I will ask one specific question, which is a bit close to my heart. It's about the special radicalism of Gandhi. He was, in a way, by many considered as the new Shiva in politics.
I'm sorry, the
new Shiva.
There's new Shiva, yeah.
The new Shiva, Because in his radicalism, he tapped into an already very strong existing structure of authority, namely the ascetics. He was the perfect ascetic. Mm-hmm. He didn't join any group or akaras or organization because he didn't really need. He established his own ashram, which was very important for the build-up of his persona, like a leader and a religious person,
Yeah. Yeah.
But that means there was already a strong ordering structure deeply seated in the Indian society in his very radicalism. Because, as you know, the ascetics, they are both transgressive and integrative to Indian society in a very special way.
Yeah.
In the same way as you might think of that his special radicalism was transgressive, but at the same time very integral to structures in Indian society.
Yeah.
He talked to the landed aristocracy, to the high caste, to different kinds of people in the very way he was transgressing in his movements, you know.
Yeah.
And it was very heavy loaded with symbolics, you know, in his very
Yes.
body language,
Yes.
as is all the ascetics in India.
Yeah. Yeah.
They talk through the body language.
Yeah.
I mean, so it was not that kind of wild radicalism that could overthrow everything, like the
Yeah.
like the landless laborers, for
Yeah.
example. That kind of radicalism is extremely different, you know, and it's got its different expression in Indian politics also, not only in Pakistan.
Right. Yeah. No.
It's been marginal, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a special mixture of transgression and structure in its very radicalism.
Yes, and that's what makes it so special. And that, and no, just to be, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I spent a lot of time in the book talking about cloth nationalism and the symbolic nature of cloth in India and why it's so symbolic that Gandhi, you know, he dresses in a particular kind of cloth that has all these symbolic meanings in the Indian context. So what I think he is an absolute genius at is using, as you said, he invokes Hinduism and a lot of the kind of social structure and hierarchy of Hinduism to his cause. But he also is, so, you know, Gandhi in some ways is thought of as not radical enough in the modern Indian context. I mean, a lot of progressives in India today would say, you know, he didn't go nearly far enough. He didn't, you know, revolutionize caste. And, you know, by the same token, at the time, he was incredibly radical. And that, and I think his genius was to take currency, to take a kind of language of cloth and of symbolism, and to to weaponize it as a political resource. And I think he did that very, very effectively. So, you know, you can look at him as a radical, but I think you can also look at him as a moderate, as many progressives do today. But, you know, so I think I just will stop on a note of agreement. You know, I agree with you. I think you mentioned, Michael, the Rudolphs, and I think Suzanne and Lloyd Rudolph wrote a piece comparing Gandhi's ashram to Habermas's use of the coffee house in Europe. So if the coffee house is the place in Europe where people come together on the basis of political equality for the first time. So you might have your private identities, but you come to a coffee house, and in kind of I can't remember when he talks about it, what period in Europe, but individuals are coming together for the first time, and they're leaving their social status behind and having conversations on a person-to-person basis. And that's what Gandhi does in his ashrams, is that he creates a space where you come irrespective of your caste affiliations, and you come together, and that you actually, it's Gandhi's ashram that they write is the brokers the emergence of a public sphere in India, and I think that's exactly right.
It probably is 4:30 now.
No, 2 minutes. So we have room for more questions.
Does anyone have a one-sentence question that can be addressed in one sentence? Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so quick and easy. Name one factor that's behind the decline of the Congress Party in modern-day India.
Time. I think all nationalist parties have a best-by date, and the adherence to party lives in the minds of the nationalist leaders who are very committed to the party because it was the carrier of the nationalist movement. A generation or two afterwards, there's no reason to necessarily adhere to that party any longer. So, and I think that's true of most nationalist parties, that they give way to competition, and they should give way to competition over the long term.
Well, not only the content, but your style, your approachability is what makes these events really good. This was really as good as it gets, I think. Thanks to you. Thank you very much, Maya.
Me.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Professor Tudor?